The summer sun blazed across the Arizona desert like a furnace in the sky, turning everything below into waves of shimmering heat. Jacob Morrison, known to most folks as simply Jake, urged his horse forward through the endless stretch of sand and rock that seemed to go on forever. He was a man in his early 30s, but the harsh frontier life had already carved deep lines into his sun-darkened face, making him look older than his years. Jake's blue eyes, faded like old denim from squinting against the relentless sun, scanned the horizon with the practiced gaze of someone who had learned to read the land for survival. His worn leather hat sat low on his head, its brim curled from years of use, and his clothes were patched and dusty from weeks of travel. Everything he owned in this world was either on his back or strapped to his horse. The horse beneath him was a dusty brown gelding he had named simply Dusty, and the animal had been his faithful companion for nearly 5 years. Dusty was not a fancy horse or a fast horse, but he was steady and reliable, which meant everything out here where one mistake could mean death. The horse's ribs showed slightly through his coat, evidence that food and water had been scarce on their journey, but his spirit remained strong. Jake had not always been a wanderer, just 2 years earlier. He had owned a small cattle ranch in eastern Arizona with his wife Mary and their young daughter Emma. Life had been hard but good, filled with honest work and simple pleasures. But then the drought came, lasting month after terrible month. The water holes dried up, the grass turned to dust, and the cattle began to die. Jake watched helplessly as everything he had built slowly withered away. Then came the fever, typhoid, the doctor had said. Though by the time the doctor arrived from the distant town, it was already too late. Mary died first. Her hand clutched in Jake's as she whispered her final words, asking him to take care of their daughter. 3 days later, little Emma followed her mother, leaving Jake alone in a world that suddenly felt empty and cold despite the burning sun. After burying his family on a small hill overlooking the ranch, Jake could not bear to stay. The land held too many memories, too many ghosts. He sold what little remained of his herd for almost nothing, packed his few belongings, and set out west with no clear destination in mind. He just needed to move, to ride away from the pain, though he knew deep down that grief traveled with him like a shadow. For weeks now, he had been crossing through increasingly rough territory. The land here was wild and dangerous, home to scorpions, rattlesnakes, and the occasional mountain lion. It was also Apache territory, and while Jake had nothing against the native people, he knew that tensions between settlers and tribes often ran hot. Many ranchers and cowboys shot first and asked questions later when they encountered Apache. But Jake had never been that kind of man. His father, a former Army scout who had learned to respect the native tribes, had taught Jake that all people deserve dignity, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke. A man's character isn't shown by how he treats his equals, his father used to say, but by how he treats those who can do nothing for him. Those words had stuck with Jake through the years. Now, as Dusty's hooves crunched across the rocky ground, Jake wondered what he was really searching for out here in this wilderness. A new start seemed like a distant dream when he could barely think beyond the next water source or the next town. He had heard there were opportunities in California, gold in the hills and land for the taking, but those were just stories. And Jake had learned that stories rarely matched reality. The canyon walls rose high on either side of him now, their red and orange layers telling the story of millions of years. The path was narrow here, barely wide enough for horse and rider, with steep drops on one side and sheer rock face on the other. Jake kept Dusty to the inside, away from the edge, his hand resting easy on the reins. He had learned long ago not to fight the horse, but to trust the animal's instincts. A hot wind blew through the canyon, carrying with it the scent of sage and something else, something Jake could not quite identify. Dusty's ears flicked forward and back, alert to sounds that Jake's duller human hearing could not detect. The horse had good instincts, better than most men Jake had known, and he had learned to pay attention when Dusty seemed nervous or alert. As they rounded a bend where the canyon opened up slightly, Jake pulled Dusty to a stop and reached for his water canteen. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was wet, and that was all that mattered. He took a small sip, swished it around his mouth, and swallowed. He then poured a bit into his hat and held it for Dusty to drink. Watching as the horse's soft nose dipped into the makeshift bowl, Jake was about to move on when he heard it, a sound so faint that he almost missed it under the whisper of wind through the rocks. He froze, listening hard. There it was again. A cry, weak and distant, almost like a bird, but not quite. Dusty heard it too, his ears rotating toward the source like compass needles finding north. Every instinct told Jake to mind his own business and keep moving. Out here. Getting involved in other people's troubles was a quick way to end up dead. The sound could be a trap, luring unwary travelers to their doom. Or it could be nothing at all, just the wind playing tricks. But something in that cry spoke of genuine distress, of a life hanging in the balance. And Jake found he could not ignore it. He dismounted slowly, his hand instinctively checking the revolver at his hip. It was there, loaded and ready, though Jake hoped he would not need it. He tied Dusty's reins loosely to a scraggly bush, leaving them slack enough that the horse could pull free if danger came. Then, moving carefully across the loose rocks, Jake followed the sound. Jake moved carefully across the loose rocks, his boots finding purchase on the uneven ground as he followed the faint cries that grew slightly louder with each step. The afternoon sun beat down on his shoulders, and sweat trickled down his back beneath his dusty shirt. He climbed over a fallen boulder, its surface hot enough to burn through his leather gloves, and made his way toward a cluster of rocks that formed a natural shelter beneath an overhanging cliff. The cries stopped suddenly, replaced by an eerie silence that made the hair on the back of Jake's neck stand up. He froze in place, listening intently for any sound that might indicate danger. An ambush, a wounded animal, or something worse. His hand hovered near his revolver, ready but not drawn. He had learned that sometimes showing a weapon too quickly could create violence where none had existed before. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice sounding strange and too loud in the quiet canyon. "I heard someone calling. I mean no harm?" There was no response at first. Just the whisper of wind through the rocks and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Then Jake heard it, a sharp intake of breath, the sound of someone in pain trying to remain silent. He moved forward more slowly now, his eyes scanning the shadows beneath the rock overhang. What he saw made him stop in his tracks there. Partially hidden in the shade of the rocks lay a young woman. Her skin was the deep bronze color of the Apache people, and her long black hair was matted with dust and dried blood. She wore traditional clothing, a deerskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of careful craftsmanship. Her dark eyes watched him with a mixture of terror and defiance, like a cornered animal that knew it could not escape but refused to submit. Jake raised both hands slowly, palms out, showing he held no weapon. "Easy now," he said softly, using the same gentle tone he would use with a frightened horse. "I am not going to hurt you." The woman said nothing, but her eyes followed his every movement with fierce intensity. Jake could see now that her right leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the deerskin legging torn and soaked with blood. A fall, he thought. Probably from the cliff above where he could see disturbed rocks and a broken path. She must have been gathering plants or herbs when the ground gave way beneath her. Scattered around her were several woven baskets, some still containing desert plants and roots that Jake recognized as medicinal herbs. So she had been out gathering medicine when disaster struck. Now she lay here, broken and bleeding, in the merciless heat with no way to call for help or save herself. Jake took a cautious step forward, and the woman immediately tried to push herself backward, crying out in pain as the movement jarred her injured leg. Fresh blood seeped through the makeshift bandage she had torn from her dress and wrapped around the wound. She had spirit. Jake had to give her that. Injured and alone, she still fought to protect herself. "Please," Jake said, keeping his voice low and steady. "I can see you are hurt badly. That leg needs proper attention, or you will lose it. Maybe worse." The woman's jaw clenched, and she spoke for the first time, her voice raspy from thirst and pain. The words were in Apache, a language Jake did not understand, but the tone was clear enough. She was telling him to stay away, to leave her alone. Her hand clutched a small knife, its blade no longer than Jake's palm. A tool meant for cutting plants, not fighting, but she held it like it was a mighty sword. Jake nodded slowly, understanding her fear perfectly. How many stories had she heard about white men who attacked Apache women? How many friends or family members had suffered at the hands of settlers who saw all natives as enemies? He could not blame her for her terror. In her position, he would feel the same way. "I know you do not trust me," Jake said, though he suspected she understood little or no English. "And I do not blame you one bit. But look at the sun, it is past midday now. In a few hours it will set, and the cold will come. You cannot survive out here alone with that injury." He pointed to his eyes, then to her leg, then gestured to show a person walking. Finally, he shook his head and made an X with his arms. His meaning was clear. She could not walk. She could not survive alone. The woman's eyes narrowed, studying him with an intelligence that saw beyond his words to his intentions. She was trying to read him the same way he read the land, looking for signs of danger or deceit. Jake stayed perfectly still, letting her look her fill, letting her see that he meant what he said. Slowly, carefully, Jake took off his hat and set it on the ground, a gesture of respect and peace. Then he unbuckled his gun belt and laid it beside the hat, placing himself at her mercy if she wanted to attack him. If this was some kind of elaborate trap, he had just made himself completely vulnerable. But he needed her to understand that he was not her enemy. The woman's eyes widened slightly at this unexpected action. No white man she had ever encountered had willingly disarmed himself in front of an Apache. Even an injured woman, she lowered the knife slightly. Though she did not put it away, her breathing was labored now, and Jake could see fever sweat beading on her forehead despite the shade. Infection was setting in, and time was running out. Jake picked up his canteen from his belt and held it out, shaking it gently so she could hear the water sloshing inside. Water was precious in the desert, more valuable than gold, and offering it was a gesture of genuine friendship. The woman's cracked lips parted slightly, her thirst warring with her fear. He set the canteen on the ground midway between them and backed away several steps. Giving her space to make her own choice, the woman watched him for a long moment, then reached forward with her free hand and grabbed the canteen. Pulling it close to her body, she opened it with trembling fingers and took a small sip. Then another, longer one. The relief on her face was immediate and obvious. While she drank, Jake examined the situation more carefully. Her leg was definitely broken, possibly in more than one place, and the bleeding, while not immediately life-threatening, would not stop on its own. She needed a doctor, or at least someone with medical knowledge. The nearest town was 2 days' ride east, too far for her to make it in her condition, but she had indicated with her eyes, when Jake had gestured in different directions, that her village lay to the north, perhaps half a day's journey. Jake's mind raced through the options. All of them bad. He could try to carry her on Dusty, but the rough terrain and her injuries made that nearly impossible without causing more damage. He could leave her here with supplies and ride for help, but she might not last that long, and he had no guarantee that anyone he brought back would be willing to help an Apache woman. Then there was the third option, the one that made no logical sense at all but felt right in his gut. He could give her his horse, give her directions and supplies, and trust that she could make it back to her people. It would mean stranding himself in hostile territory with no transportation. No way to escape if danger came. It would mean almost certain death, or at best, a long and brutal walk through country that killed strong men even when they were properly equipped. Jake looked at the young woman, seeing in her eyes the same fire and determination he had seen in his own daughter's eyes. The will to live, to survive against impossible odds. He thought of Mary and Emma, buried on that lonely hillside. And he knew what they would want him to do. His decision was made. Now he just had to figure out how to make her understand. Jake sat down slowly on a flat rock about 10 feet away from the injured woman, giving her space while he worked through the problem in his mind. The desert heat pressed down on them both like a heavy blanket, and he could see that her condition was getting worse with each passing minute. Her breathing had become more shallow and rapid, clear signs that shock and infection were taking hold of her body. The woman watched him warily, still clutching the small knife in one hand and his canteen in the other. She had stopped trying to move away from him, perhaps realizing that her strength was fading fast, or perhaps beginning to understand that he truly meant her no harm. Her eyes were starting to lose some of their sharp focus, drifting occasionally before snapping back to attention. Jake knew that look. He had seen it before in wounded soldiers during his brief time in the cavalry, and later in sick cattle during the drought. It was the look of a body beginning to shut down, conserving what little energy remained for the most basic functions of survival. If something did not change soon, she would slip into unconsciousness, and then it would be too late. He pulled out his pocket knife and cut a strip of cloth from the bottom of his already tattered shirt. Then he gathered some straight sticks from nearby dead brush. His movements were slow and deliberate, making sure she could see everything he was doing. He held up the sticks and the cloth strips, then pointed to her leg, pantomiming the action of splinting a broken bone. The woman's eyes followed his gestures, and after a moment, she gave a slight nod. Permission granted. But just barely, Jake moved closer, inch by careful inch, until he was kneeling beside her injured leg. Up close, he could see that the break was bad. Very bad. The bone had likely snapped in at least 2 places, and there was significant swelling around the knee and ankle. "This is going to hurt," Jake said quietly, knowing she could not understand his words but hoping his tone would prepare her. "I am sorry, but it has to be done." He worked as gently as he could, straightening the leg and securing the splint with the cloth strips. The woman bit down hard on her lower lip, refusing to cry out, though tears streamed silently down her cheeks. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the knife handle, and Jake half expected her to stab him from the pain, but she held still, enduring what had to be done. When he finished, Jake moved back to his rock, giving her space to recover from the ordeal. He noticed that she had dropped the knife during the worst of the pain, and it now lay on the ground between them. She made no move to pick it up again, a small gesture of trust that meant more than words could express. Now came the harder part. The part that Jake had been turning over in his mind while he worked on her leg. He needed to make her understand his plan. But how could he communicate something so complex without a shared language? He sat thinking for several minutes, watching the sun continue its slow journey across the sky. Each passing hour brought them closer to nightfall and reduced her chances of survival. Finally, Jake stood up and walked back toward where he had left Dusty. The woman's eyes tracked him nervously, perhaps wondering if he was abandoning her after all. But Jake returned quickly. Leading the horse by the reins, Dusty walked calmly, his hooves clopping softly on the rocky ground. The horse showed no fear of the woman, which Jake took as a good sign. He brought Dusty close to where the woman lay and tied the reins loosely to a nearby rock. Then Jake began his elaborate pantomime, pointing first to the woman, then to the horse. Then making a motion of someone riding, he pointed north, the direction she had indicated earlier when asked about her village. He held up fingers, opening and closing his hand to indicate hours or distance. The woman's eyes widened as she began to understand what he was proposing. She shook her head vigorously, speaking rapidly in Apache, her tone clearly indicating that she thought he was crazy. She pointed at him, then at the desert around them, then made a slashing motion across her throat. Her meaning was unmistakable. If he stayed here alone without a horse, he would die. Jake nodded, acknowledging that she was absolutely right. Then he shrugged, a gesture that needed no translation. He pointed at her injured leg, then at the sun sinking lower in the sky, then made the same throat-slashing gesture. She would die too if she stayed here. They both knew it, at least his way. One of them might survive. But the woman continued to shake her head, her eyes filling with fresh tears. This time not from physical pain, but from something else. Confusion, perhaps, or disbelief that a stranger would sacrifice himself for her. She kept saying something in Apache, the same words over and over, and though Jake could not translate them, he could hear the question in her voice. Why? Why would you do this? Jake wished he had the words to explain it properly. To tell her about Mary and Emma, about the code his father had taught him, about how helping her was the first thing that had made him feel truly alive since losing his family. But he had no words she would understand, so instead he just smiled sadly and began preparing Dusty for the journey. He took his bedroll off the horse and set it on the ground. He would need it for the cold desert night. Then he removed the saddlebags and sorted through their contents. He kept only his knife, a small amount of jerky, and 1 water flask. Everything else, The remaining food, the extra water, his spare clothes, the matches, the ammunition, even his few precious dollars. He loaded back onto Dusty or placed within the woman's reach. The woman watched this process with growing distress, shaking her head and speaking urgently in her language. She tried once to grab his arm to stop him, but the movement caused her such pain that she gasped and fell back. Jake gently patted her hand, then continued his preparations. He helped her into a sitting position, moving carefully to avoid jarring her injured leg. Then came the hardest part, getting her onto the horse. Dusty stood patient and still as Jake lifted her, the woman crying out despite her efforts to stay silent. He positioned her as securely as he could in the saddle, tying her injured leg loosely to the stirrup to keep it stable, and showing her how to hold the saddle horn for balance. Jake adjusted the reins so she could manage them with one hand. Dusty was a smart horse and would follow the trail north with minimal guidance. He gave the horse a long look, running his hand along the animal's neck one final time. They had been through so much together, and now he was sending his faithful companion away, perhaps forever. "You take care of her, boy," Jake whispered into Dusty's ear. "Get her home safe." The woman was crying openly now, speaking rapidly in Apache, and Jake wished more than anything that he could understand her words. He handed her the reins and pointed north again, making riding motions with his hands. She had to go now, while she still had the strength. While daylight remained, she reached down and touched Jake's face with her hand, a gesture so unexpected and intimate that it made his throat tight. Her palm was hot with fever, but her touch was gentle. She said something in a soft voice, 3 words that Jake committed to memory even though he did not know their meaning. Then she nodded once, squeezed his hand, and turned Dusty north. Jake watched as horse and rider moved slowly up the trail. Growing smaller with distance, the woman looked back once. Raising her hand in farewell or thanks, or perhaps both, Jake raised his own hand in response. Then they disappeared around a bend in the canyon, and he was alone. The silence that followed was profound and absolute. Jake stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of what he had just done settle over him like a physical thing. He had given away his only means of survival to a complete stranger, someone he would likely never see again, by all logical reasoning. He had just signed his own death warrant, but as Jake turned back to the small shelter beneath the rocks, gathering his meager remaining supplies, he felt no regret. For the first time since burying his family, he had acted not from despair or aimless wandering, but from genuine compassion. He had saved a life, and if that meant sacrificing his own, then so be it. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and gold. Jake settled into the shade, rationing his small amount of water and preparing himself for whatever the night and the days beyond would bring. The evening shadows grew longer across the canyon floor as Jake watched the last traces of dust settle where Dusty and the Apache woman had disappeared from view. He stood there for several minutes more, half hoping to see them return, half dreading it because it would mean something had gone wrong. But the trail remained empty, and the only sounds were the whisper of wind through the rocks and the occasional call of a desert bird seeking shelter for the night. Jake finally turned his attention to his own survival. The reality of his situation was beginning to sink in with uncomfortable clarity. He was alone in Apache territory with no horse, limited water, almost no food, and at least 3 days' walk from the nearest settlement. Assuming he could even find his way without getting lost in the maze of canyons and desert that stretched endlessly in all directions. The shelter where he had found the woman would serve as his camp for the night. It offered protection from the wind and a good view of the approaches, which would let him spot any danger before it got too close. Jake gathered more dead brush and stacked it nearby, not for a fire, which would be visible for miles and might attract unwanted attention, but as a windbreak and potential fuel if he grew desperate enough to risk the flames. He examined his remaining supplies with a sinking feeling. 1 water flask, perhaps 3/4 full, a small handful of dried jerky that would last 2 days if he was careful, 1 if he was honest about his hunger, his knife, his revolver with 6 bullets, and his bedroll. That was everything he had left in the world. It was not much to bet his life on. The sun finally dropped below the canyon rim, and the temperature began to fall almost immediately. This was the desert's cruel joke. Burning hot during the day and freezing cold at night, Jake wrapped himself in his bedroll and settled back against the rocks. Trying to conserve energy and warmth, his stomach growled, reminding him that he had not eaten since early morning. But he ignored it. He needed to stretch his meager supplies as long as possible. As darkness filled the canyon like rising water, Jake's mind began to wander. He thought about the woman he had saved, wondering if she had made it back to her village yet, wondering if Dusty was taking care of her the way Jake had asked. He tried to picture her arrival, the surprise and relief of her family, the questions they would ask about the white man who had given her his horse. Would they believe her story? Would they think she was delirious from fever and pain, making up impossible tales? Or would they understand that somewhere in the desert, a stranger was dying alone because he had chosen compassion over survival? Jake hoped they would at least take care of Dusty. The horse deserved better than to end up as someone's dinner or to be abandoned once the woman was safely home. The night grew colder, and Jake pulled the bedroll tighter around his shoulders. Above him, stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Thousands of them, more than anyone could count in a lifetime. They were beautiful and utterly indifferent to his fate, shining down on the just and unjust alike, on the living and the dying, on those who made foolish sacrifices and those who looked out only for themselves. Jake found himself talking to Mary and Emma, something he had not done since the early days after their deaths. "I hope you are not too disappointed in me," he said quietly to the stars. "I know it was not smart what I did today. You always said I had more heart than sense, Mary. And I guess you were right about that." He imagined Mary's response. Could almost hear her voice in the wind. She would have been angry at first, furious that he had thrown his life away so carelessly. But then she would have understood. She had always understood him better than he understood himself. She would have seen that saving the Apache woman had been the first meaningful thing he had done since losing his family, the first choice that felt right and true. Emma would have been proud, though. Jake continued, smiling despite his circumstances. Remember how she always brought home injured animals? Birds with broken wings, rabbits the cat had caught. Even that rattlesnake that one time nearly gave us both heart attacks. She had your big heart, Mary. She would have done the same thing I did today, probably without even thinking twice about it. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance. Its cry echoing off the canyon walls, other coyotes answered, their voices creating an eerie chorus that made Jake's skin prickle. He checked his revolver, making sure it was within easy reach. 6 bullets were not many. But they would have to be enough if the coyotes came calling, or if something worse found him in the darkness. The hours crawled by with painful slowness. Jake dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound, real or imagined. His body ached from the hard ground, and his leg cramped from being in one position too long when he tried to shift. The movement brought a sharp pain in his lower back that made him gasp. He was not a young man anymore, and sleeping rough on the desert floor was taking its toll. Around midnight, by Jake's estimation, the temperature dropped even further. His breath came out in visible puffs, and he found himself shivering despite the bedroll. He had been through cold nights before, many of them, but somehow this one felt different. More dangerous, perhaps it was the lack of a fire, or perhaps it was the knowledge that his body had no reserves left to fight the cold. He had been traveling too long, eating too little, and grief had already worn him down before he ever gave away his horse. Jake thought about his father, the old scout who had taught him everything about surviving in the wilderness. What would the old man think of his son's choice today? Would he see it as noble or foolish? Probably both. His father had always been practical about survival, but he had also been the one to teach Jake that some things mattered more than just staying alive. "A man has to be able to live with himself," his father had said once. After Jake had asked why he shared his food with a starving Navajo family they had encountered, "And I could not live with myself knowing I let decent folks starve when I had enough to share. Sometimes staying alive is not the most important thing, son. Sometimes keeping your soul intact matters more." Those words had stuck with Jake through the years, and now, shivering in the darkness with death perhaps only days away, he understood them better than ever. He had kept his soul intact today. He had acted like a human being instead of just another animal fighting for survival. If that meant he died out here, at least he would die knowing he had done something good, something that mattered. The coyotes howled again. Closer this time, Jake sat up straighter, his hand moving to his revolver. He could see eyes reflecting in the darkness, multiple pairs. Circling his position at a cautious distance, the predators could smell weakness, could sense that he was alone and vulnerable. They were testing him, trying to decide if he was worth the risk of an attack. Jake stood up slowly, making himself as large as possible. He picked up a rock and threw it hard toward the nearest pair of eyes. The rock clattered against stone and the eyes disappeared, backing away into the safety of darkness. But they did not leave entirely. Jake could still feel them out there, watching, waiting for him to show more weakness or fall asleep. He spent the rest of the night standing. Feeding sticks into a small fire he finally allowed himself to build. The risk of attracting human attention seemed less important than keeping the coyotes at bay. The flames danced and flickered, casting wild shadows on the canyon walls. Jake watched them dance and tried not to think about how much his water flask weighed, how little food remained, or how many miles stretched between him and safety. When dawn finally broke, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Jake felt exhausted but strangely peaceful. He had survived one night, that was something. He allowed himself a small sip of water and a tiny piece of jerky, then packed up his bedroll and prepared to start walking. The woman had gone north toward her village, so Jake would head south. Back the way he had come, it would be a long walk. Possibly an impossible one, but he had to try. Sitting here waiting to die was not in his nature. As long as he had strength left, he would keep moving. Jake took one last look north, toward where he had sent Dusty and the Apache woman. "Good luck," he whispered. Then he turned south and began to walk. Jake's boots scraped against the rocky ground as he made his way south through the narrow canyon passage. Each step sent small cascades of pebbles tumbling down the slope, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. The sun had barely cleared the canyon rim, but already he could feel its heat beginning to build, promising another scorching day ahead. His body protested the movement after the brutal night. Muscles that had stiffened from cold and uncomfortable sleep now complained with every stride. His back throbbed with a dull ache that radiated down his right leg, and his feet, already blistered from weeks of travel, felt raw inside his worn boots. But Jake pushed these discomforts to the back of his mind and focused on the simple act of placing one foot in front of the other. The terrain was unforgiving, a maze of rocks and hard-packed earth scattered with thorny scrub brush and the occasional stubborn cactus. Jake moved carefully, knowing that a twisted ankle or a fall could be a death sentence in his current situation. He used his eyes constantly, scanning the ground ahead for obstacles and the horizon for landmarks, trying to fix his position in his memory. By mid-morning, the heat had become oppressive. The canyon walls seemed to trap the hot air and magnify it, turning the passage into a natural oven. Sweat soaked through Jake's shirt and ran down his face, stinging his eyes and leaving trails of salt on his sun-darkened skin. His mouth felt like it was full of cotton, and his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. He allowed himself another small sip from his water flask. The liquid was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most delicious thing Jake had ever experienced. He swished it around his mouth before swallowing. Trying to make the moisture last as long as possible, the flask felt lighter in his hand, a dangerous reminder of how limited his resources were. The sun climbed higher, and Jake's shadow shrank until it was just a small, dark puddle at his feet. He estimated he had been walking for about 4 hours and had covered perhaps 6 or 7 miles. Not bad for a man on foot in rough country, but nowhere near fast enough at this pace. It would take him at least 3 full days to reach the nearest settlement, and he had water for maybe 1 day, 2 if he was extremely careful. Jake found a small overhang that offered a slice of shade and decided to rest during the hottest part of the day. Walking in the full afternoon sun would be suicide. Better to conserve his strength and wait for cooler temperatures. He sat with his back against the rock, feeling the stored heat radiating from the stone even in the shade. His stomach cramped with hunger, but he resisted the urge to eat. Food required water for digestion, and water was more precious than gold right now. Instead, he closed his eyes and tried to rest. to escape the discomfort of his body through sleep. But sleep would not come. His mind was too active, racing through memories and regrets, plans and fears. He thought about the Apache woman again. By now, she should have reached her village. Her people would be caring for her leg, giving her medicine and water, keeping her safe. The thought brought Jake a measure of comfort. At least his sacrifice had not been in vain. At least one life had been saved from the desert's cruel indifference. A lizard scurried across the rocks near Jake's boot, its scales glinting like jewels in the harsh light. It paused for a moment, regarding him with ancient, unblinking eyes, then darted away into a crack in the rock. Jake envied the creature its perfect adaptation to this harsh environment, how it could survive on almost nothing, finding moisture in insects and shelter in the smallest spaces. The afternoon stretched endlessly. Time seemed to move differently in the desert. Expanding and contracting in strange ways, minutes felt like hours. Yet when Jake checked the sun's position, he was surprised by how much time had actually passed. The heat pressed down on him like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. He must have dozed despite himself, because he jerked awake suddenly with his heart pounding. The sun had moved considerably, and the quality of light had changed, indicating late afternoon. Jake stood up stiffly, every joint protesting, and prepared to resume his journey. He allowed himself another tiny sip of water, noticing with growing concern that the flask was now less than half full. As Jake walked, he began to notice signs that worried him. The landscape looked less familiar than it should. He could not remember passing that particular rock formation on his way in, and the canyon seemed to be narrowing in a way that did not match his memory. A cold fear settled in his stomach. Had he taken a wrong turn somewhere? Was he lost? He stopped and tried to orient himself using the sun, which was now sinking toward the western horizon. South should be behind him. North ahead, east to his left, west to his right. But the canyon twisted and turned so much that maintaining a straight direction was impossible. He might have been zigzagging without realizing it. Gradually veering off course, Jake forced himself to stay calm. Panic killed people in the wilderness faster than thirst or hunger. He needed to think clearly, to use his head. He climbed up a rocky slope to get a better view, ignoring the way his lungs burned and his legs trembled with effort. From the higher vantage point, he could see more of the surrounding terrain. What he saw was not encouraging. Canyons and rock formations stretched in every direction, a labyrinth of stone that all looked maddeningly similar. In the distance, he could see what might be a mountain range, but heat shimmer made it impossible to judge distances accurately. He tried to remember if he had seen those mountains before, but his memory was fuzzy, clouded by exhaustion and dehydration. The sun touched the horizon, and Jake knew he needed to find shelter for the night. He made his way back down the slope, moving more carefully now as fatigue made him clumsy. Near the bottom, his boot slipped on loose gravel, and he fell hard, landing on his side with an impact that drove the air from his lungs. For a long moment, Jake lay there gasping, tasting dust and blood where he had bitten his lip. Pain radiated from his ribs, sharp enough to make him wonder if he had cracked one. He did a careful inventory of his body, moving each limb, checking for serious injury. Nothing seemed broken, but he would have spectacular bruises, and his ribs would hurt for days. Jake pulled himself to his feet, swaying slightly as a wave of dizziness washed over him. He was deteriorating faster than he had expected. The lack of food and water, combined with the physical exertion and stress, was taking a severe toll. He needed water soon, or he would not make it another day, as if mocking his thoughts. He heard a sound that made his heart leap. Water, running water somewhere nearby. Jake froze, listening intently. There it was again, the unmistakable trickle and splash of a stream or spring. It sounded close, maybe just beyond the next rise. Hope surged through Jake's exhausted body, giving him a burst of energy. He moved toward the sound, climbing over rocks and pushing through scrub brush. The sound grew louder, more distinct. Definitely water. Life-saving, precious water. He rounded a large boulder and stopped, his hope dying as quickly as it had been born. There was no stream, no spring, nothing but dry rocks and dust. The sound continued, though, and Jake realized with bitter disappointment what he was hearing. Wind. moving through a gap in the rocks in such a way that it created the illusion of running water. It was a cruel trick, one that had probably killed desperate travelers before him. Jake sank down onto a rock, feeling the last of his energy drain away. He had been fooled by a desert mirage, the kind that sound made instead of sight. It was a sign of how desperate he had become, how much his judgment was being affected by his deteriorating condition. He needed to be more careful, to question his perceptions, or he would end up walking in circles until he collapsed. The sun disappeared below the horizon, and twilight settled over the canyon. Jake found a small depression between rocks that would serve as shelter and spread out his bedroll. He took another sip of water, trying not to notice how light the flask had become. Tomorrow he would need to make hard choices about his direction, about whether to keep heading south or try to find a different route. As darkness fell and the stars emerged, Jake lay looking up at the vast sky. He thought about the Apache woman riding through a similar night, safely among her people now, and he smiled. Whatever happened to him, he had done something good, something that mattered. That knowledge would have to be enough. Jake woke to the gray light of pre-dawn, his body shaking uncontrollably from the cold. During the night, the temperature had dropped so low that frost had formed on his bedroll, and his breath came out in thick white clouds. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as every muscle in his body screamed in protest. The fall from yesterday had left him far more injured than he had realized. His ribs throbbed with each breath, and his left shoulder had swollen to the point where he could barely move his arm. He reached for his water flask with trembling fingers and unscrewed the cap, tilting it to his cracked lips. Only a few drops came out. The flask was empty. Jake stared at it in disbelief. He could have sworn there was more water left. Then he saw the damp patch on his bedroll and understood. The flask must have been damaged in his fall, leaking slowly throughout the night until every precious drop was gone. The realization hit Jake like a physical blow. Without water, he had maybe 12 hours, perhaps less in his weakened condition. The nearest settlement was still at least 2 days away, even if he knew exactly which direction to go, which he did not. For the first time since giving Dusty to the Apache woman, Jake felt genuine fear, not the manageable concern of a difficult situation, but the cold terror of knowing that death was no longer a possibility but a certainty. He forced himself to stand, using the rock wall for support. His legs shook beneath him. Weak and unsteady, the world tilted and spun, and Jake had to close his eyes until the dizziness passed. When he opened them again, he noticed something that made his remaining hope crumble even further. His vision was blurry around the edges, and dark spots danced in his peripheral vision. Signs of severe dehydration and the beginning of organ failure. Jake knew he should start walking, should try to cover as much ground as possible while he still had strength. But his body refused to cooperate. His legs felt like they were made of wood, stiff and unresponsive. He managed 3 steps before his knees buckled and he fell forward. Catching himself on his hands, the impact sent sharp pain through his injured ribs, and he cried out, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. He stayed on his hands and knees for several minutes, breathing hard, tasting blood in his mouth. This was it then. This was how his story ended. Alone in a desert canyon, dying slowly from thirst and exposure. No one would ever know what happened to him. His body would be found eventually if the scavengers left anything to find. Just another foolish traveler who had underestimated the desert's cruelty. Jake thought of Mary and Emma, and for the first time, he felt grateful that they were not alive to see this. Mary would have been heartbroken, and Emma would have cried for her papa. He hoped that wherever they were, they could not see him now, broken and dying. Crawling on the ground like a wounded animal, with tremendous effort, Jake pulled himself back to the shelter of the rocks and sat with his back against the stone. The sun was rising now, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and red that were beautiful and terrible at the same time. He watched the light spread across the landscape and made peace with what was coming. At least he would die watching something beautiful. At least his last act in this world had been one of compassion. The morning grew warmer and Jake's thirst became unbearable. His tongue had swollen in his mouth, making it hard to breathe, and his lips had cracked and begun to bleed. He tried to swallow, but his throat felt like it was coated in sand. Every breath was an effort, every heartbeat a struggle. Sometime around mid-morning, Jake began to hear things that were not there. Voices calling his name, the sound of water running nearby, the jingle of horse harnesses. He knew these were hallucinations, the product of his dying brain trying to make sense of its failing systems. But they seemed so real that he found himself answering the voices, carrying on conversations with people who existed only in his fading consciousness. He talked to his father, asking for advice about how to face death with dignity. He talked to Mary, apologizing for not being strong enough to go on living after she died. He talked to Emma, promising that he would see her soon, that Daddy was coming home. The conversations brought him comfort. Even though he knew they were not real, the sun climbed higher, and the heat became oppressive once again. Jake's skin felt like it was on fire, burning from the inside out. He tried to move deeper into the shade, but his body would not respond to his commands anymore. His arms and legs had gone numb, and a strange floating sensation had taken over, as if his spirit was already beginning to separate from his physical form. Then, through the haze of heat and hallucination, Jake heard something new, a deep rumbling sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. At first, he thought it was thunder, perhaps a storm approaching that would bring rain too late to save him. But the sound grew louder and more distinct, and Jake realized with a start that it was not thunder at all. It was hooves, many hooves, pounding against the hard desert ground. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, multiplying and amplifying until it seemed like an entire army was approaching. Jake tried to lift his head to see, but the effort was too much. His vision had narrowed to a small tunnel, the edges dark and closing in. The thunder of hooves grew closer, and now Jake could feel the vibration through the ground beneath him. He wondered if he was hallucinating again, if his dying mind was creating one last fantasy to comfort him in his final moments. But the sound was too real, too powerful, too distinct to be imagination. Through his failing vision, Jake saw them emerge from the heat shimmer like ghosts materializing from another world. Horses, dozens of them, their riders sitting tall and proud in the saddle. They came from the north, moving in formation with practiced precision. And as they drew closer, Jake could see that they were Apache warriors. Their faces were painted for war, and they carried weapons that glinted in the harsh sunlight. Jake's heart, which had been beating so slowly and weakly, suddenly thundered in his chest. This was not a hallucination. This was real. The Apache had found him, perhaps tracking the woman he had helped, perhaps simply patrolling their territory. It did not matter why they had come, only that they were here. The riders surrounded him in a wide circle, their horses snorting and stamping. Jake tried to speak, to explain himself. But no words came out. His throat was too dry, his tongue too swollen. He could only stare up at the warriors with eyes that could barely focus. The circle of riders parted, and through the gap came two more horses. One carried a young Apache woman, her leg wrapped in clean white bandages. It was her, the woman Jake had saved, her face lit up with recognition and something else. Relief, perhaps, or gratitude. She was alive and healing, which meant Jake's sacrifice had not been in vain. Beside her rode an older man whose bearing and decorative clothing marked him as someone of importance. A chief or elder, his face was weathered and wise, lined with years of experience and struggle. He looked down at Jake with dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul, measuring, judging, deciding. The elder dismounted with fluid grace despite his age and approached Jake slowly. He knelt beside the dying white man and studied his face for a long moment. Then he said something in Apache, his tone respectful and solemn, the woman translated, her voice thick with emotion. "My father, Chief Nahilzai, asks if you are the one who gave his daughter your horse." Jake managed the smallest of nods, the only response his failing body could produce. The chief placed his hand on Jake's shoulder, a gesture that somehow conveyed both respect and sorrow. He spoke again, and the woman translated, "He says you are dying, but you will not die today. The Apache people do not forget those who show them honor." Warriors dismounted and moved toward Jake with purpose. They had water skins and medicine pouches, blankets and food. Jake felt strong hands lifting him gently. Heard voices speaking in urgent tones. Someone tilted a water skin to his lips, and cool liquid flowed into his mouth. He swallowed reflexively, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever tasted. As consciousness began to slip away, Jake saw Dusty among the horses, his loyal friend looking healthy and well cared for. The last thing he heard before darkness claimed him was the thunder of hooves, no longer approaching but surrounding him, protecting him, carrying him toward an impossible salvation. Jake drifted in and out of consciousness as the warriors carried him, wrapped carefully in soft blankets that smelled of sage and cedar smoke. He was aware of movement, the gentle rocking motion of being transported, but his mind could not quite grasp whether he was on a travois being dragged behind a horse or cradled in someone's arms. Time had lost all meaning, moments stretching into eternities and hours passing in what felt like heartbeats. Occasionally, he surfaced enough to perceive fragments of his surroundings. The bright blue sky above framed by canyon walls, the concerned faces of Apache warriors looking down at him, the taste of water being carefully dripped into his mouth. Each time he tried to speak, to ask questions or express gratitude, gentle hands would press him back down and soothing voices would encourage him to rest, to save his strength, to let them care for him. The woman, Ayana, as he would later learn her name, meant eternal blossom, stayed close throughout the journey. Despite her own injury, she insisted on helping tend to Jake, bathing his fevered forehead with cool water and speaking to him in a mixture of Apache and broken English she had learned from traders. Her presence seemed to calm something deep within him, a wordless reassurance that he was safe, that his act of kindness had created a bond stronger than the barriers of language and culture. When Jake finally woke with something approaching true consciousness, he found himself inside a large wickiup, the traditional Apache dwelling made of wooden poles covered with brush and hides. Sunlight filtered through the gaps in the covering, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across woven mats on the ground. The air was cooler here, scented with herbs and wood smoke, and he could hear the sounds of village life outside. Children laughing, women talking, the rhythmic sound of someone grinding corn. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain flared through his ribs and shoulder. A hand pressed gently on his chest, urging him back down. Jake turned his head and saw an elderly Apache woman sitting beside him, her face a map of wrinkles that spoke of a long and difficult life. Her eyes, however, were bright and alert, missing nothing. She smiled at him and said something in Apache, her tone warm and reassuring. The woman called out toward the entrance of the wickiup, and moments later Ayana appeared, moving carefully with the aid of a wooden crutch. Her face broke into a brilliant smile when she saw that Jake was awake. She spoke rapidly to the elderly woman, then turned to Jake and began explaining in her halting English. "You sleep 3 days?" she said, holding up 3 fingers to make sure he understood. "Very sick, almost die. My grandmother, she is healer. She give you medicine. Make you strong again, 3 days. Jake could hardly believe it. He felt like he had been lost in dreams for much longer, or perhaps much shorter. His body still felt weak, trembling with even the smallest movement. But the crushing thirst and the burning fever had subsided. He was alive, improbably, impossibly alive. "Your horse," Jake managed to croak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dusty, is he?" Ayana's smile grew even wider. "Your horse is good. He is hero, too. He bring me home safe, like you tell him. We give him much food, much water. He wait for you." Relief flooded through Jake. Warming him from the inside, Dusty was safe. The woman was safe. Somehow, against all odds, his desperate gamble had paid off. He closed his eyes for a moment, offering a silent prayer of thanks to whatever forces had allowed this miracle. Over the next few hours, as Jake slowly regained his strength, Ayana told him what had happened after she left him in the canyon. She explained how Dusty had carried her steadily northward despite her weakening grip, how the horse had seemed to sense the urgency and moved faster than she thought possible. She had reached her village just as darkness fell, collapsing into her father's arms as people rushed to help. When she told them about the white man who had given her his only horse, saving her life at the cost of his own, there had been shocked silence. No one could believe that a white settler would show such selfless compassion to an Apache woman. Many of the warriors had been skeptical, suggesting it was a trap or a trick. But Chief Nahilzai, Ayana's father, had looked into his daughter's eyes and seen the truth there. "My father say you have heart of warrior and soul of brother," Ayana translated carefully, trying to convey the weight of her father's words. "He say Apache people have debt to you that cannot be repaid with horses or gifts. You give life to his daughter, so now you are family," the elderly healer woman spoke then, and Ayana translated her words as well. "Grandmother say the spirits brought you to us for purpose. She say you carry great sadness. Lost family, lost hope. She say maybe you save my life, but we save yours too. Not just body, but spirit." Jake felt tears prick his eyes at these words. They had seen through to the core of him, understanding without explanation the grief and emptiness that had been driving him across the desert. How strange that strangers could see what he had been trying to hide even from himself. That evening, as the sun set and the village gathered for the evening meal, Chief Nahilzai came to the healing Wicayup. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, tall and dignified. With streaks of gray in his long black hair, he wore a shirt decorated with intricate beadwork and carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions for his people. Through Ayana's translation, the chief spoke to Jake. "Tomorrow, when you are stronger, we will hold ceremony. You will be adopted into our tribe. Given Apache name, made brother to our people. This is great honor given to very few outsiders, never before to white man." Jake struggled to find words adequate to express his gratitude and overwhelm. "I do not deserve such honor," he finally managed to say. "I only did what any decent person should do," Chief Nahilzai smiled slightly, a rare expression that transformed his stern face. "That is why you deserve honor," he replied through Ayana. "You do not seek it. You act from heart, not from what you can gain. This is true warrior spirit." The chief then explained what would happen in the ceremony, how the warriors would paint their faces and perform traditional dances, how Jake would be given a new name that reflected his character and his deed, how he would be welcomed as a full member of the tribe with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. It was unprecedented, the chief admitted, and some in the village were opposed to accepting a white man so completely, but the majority had been moved by Jake's sacrifice and supported the adoption. "There is more," Chief Nahilzai said, his expression becoming more serious. "We bring you gifts to honor you and show our respect. But these gifts come with message. We want you to understand what your kindness means to my people." The next morning, Jake was helped outside for the first time since arriving at the village. He blinked in the bright sunlight, taking in his surroundings with wonder. The Apache village was larger than he had expected, perhaps 40 Wicayups arranged in a loose circle, with cooking fires and work areas scattered throughout. Children played in the open spaces, and women worked at various tasks, weaving baskets, preparing food, tanning hides. But what caught Jake's attention and made his breath catch in his throat was the sight that greeted him in the center of the village. There, arranged in careful rows, were gifts beyond anything he could have imagined. Horses, at least a dozen of them, including Dusty, who whinnied with recognition when he saw Jake. There were also blankets, weapons, food supplies, tools, and other items that represented significant wealth to the Apache people. Warriors began to gather more and more of them, until Jake counted approximately 70 men standing in formation. These were not just the warriors from this village, he realized, but men who had come from other Apache bands to witness this historic moment. They stood proud and solemn, their faces painted for ceremony, their presence a testament to how seriously the tribe took this occasion. Chief Nahilzai stepped forward and began to speak in Apache, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. Ayana stood beside Jake, translating in whispers. "My father says that today we honor a man who showed us that not all white people are enemies. That kindness and compassion can cross the boundaries that divide peoples. He says your action has planted seed of hope that perhaps peace between our peoples is possible." The ceremony that followed was both beautiful and overwhelming. Warriors danced and chanted, drums beat in rhythms that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the earth itself. Jake was painted with sacred symbols and given clothing made by the tribe's finest craftspeople. And finally, he was given his Apache name, Shilanantan, which Ayanna translated as brother chief or one who leads through kindness. The weeks following Jake's adoption ceremony passed in a blur of healing and learning. His body slowly regained its strength under the careful attention of the tribal healer. And his spirit, which had been hollow and dead since losing Mary and Emma, began to tentatively come back to life. The Apache people welcomed him not as a curiosity or an outsider to be tolerated, but as true family, teaching him their language, their customs, and their ways of understanding the world. Ayanna became his primary teacher and closest friend. Her leg was healing well, though she would always walk with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the day that had bound their fates together. She seemed to take special pleasure in teaching Jake Apache words, laughing good-naturedly at his clumsy pronunciation and patient when he struggled to grasp concepts that had no equivalent in English. Through their lessons, Jake began to understand that the Apache worldview was fundamentally different from the one he had grown up with, centered on harmony with the land and community rather than individual acquisition and conquest. Chief Nahilzai spent hours with Jake, explaining the complex web of relationships and obligations that held Apache society together. The chief seemed to recognize in Jake a kindred spirit, someone who understood that true strength came not from dominance, but from service to others. He told Jake stories of the old days before the white settlers came in overwhelming numbers, when the Apache had ranged freely across vast territories and lived according to traditions established over countless generations. "We are not warriors because we love war," the chief explained one evening as they sat by a fire. Ayanna translating, "We are warriors because we must protect what we love. Our families, our way of life, our sacred places. Your people see us as savages. But we fight only to survive, to preserve what is being taken from us piece by piece." These conversations opened Jake's eyes to perspectives he had never considered before. He had absorbed, without quite realizing it, the common settler view that the land was empty and waiting to be claimed, that the native peoples were obstacles to progress rather than human beings with legitimate claims and deep connections to the territory. Now, living among the Apache, seeing their humanity up close, he felt ashamed of his former ignorance. As Jake's strength fully returned, he began to consider his future. The Apache had made it clear he was welcome to stay with them permanently, to make their village his home, and part of him was deeply tempted by the offer. The peace he felt here, the sense of belonging to something larger than himself, was healing wounds he had thought would never close. But another part of him, the part that still carried Mary's and Emma's memories, knew he needed to find his own path. It was Chief Nahilzai who provided the solution. "You belong here, but you also belong out there," he said, gesturing toward the wider world beyond the village. "You are bridge between two peoples. Perhaps you can use this position to bring understanding where now there is only fear and hatred." The idea took root in Jake's mind and grew. What if he established a ranch on land between Apache territory and settler communities? What if he created a place where both peoples could trade peacefully, where understanding could replace suspicion? It was ambitious, perhaps impossibly so, but it felt right in a way nothing had felt right since losing his family. When Jake proposed the idea to the tribal council, there was considerable debate. Some warriors argued that any cooperation with white settlers would ultimately lead to betrayal and loss of more land. They pointed to the long history of broken treaties and promises unkept. Others, however, saw wisdom in Jake's proposal, arguing that having a trusted intermediary might help prevent conflicts born of misunderstanding. Chief Nahilzai ultimately sided with those who supported the idea. "Shilanantan has proven his honor," he declared. "If there is any white man we can trust to keep his word and treat our people fairly, it is him. And if his experiment fails, we lose nothing. But if it succeeds, we gain something precious. A friend in the world that is changing around us." Whether we wish it or not, the tribe helped Jake establish his ranch on a piece of land in a valley that had long served as neutral ground between different Apache bands. It was beautiful country with good water and grass, the kind of place that could support cattle and horses. Warriors helped him build a sturdy cabin and outbuildings, and families contributed animals from their own herds to give him a start. Jake named the ranch Two Rivers after a nearby place where two streams joined together. Becoming stronger through their union, the name also carried a deeper meaning, the coming together of two peoples, two ways of life, finding common ground despite their differences. Word of the unusual arrangement spread quickly through both Apache and settler communities. Some white ranchers were outraged, accusing Jake of being an Indian lover and a traitor to his race. They threatened him, warned him that his experiment would end in his death, and predicted the Apache would betray him at the first opportunity. But others, particularly those who had lost loved ones to the endless cycle of violence, were cautiously intrigued. The first tentative trades happened within months of the ranch's establishment. A settler needed horses and had heard the Apache bred excellent animals but was terrified to approach their territory directly. Jake served as intermediary, facilitating the transaction and ensuring both parties felt safe and fairly treated. The trade went smoothly, and word spread that Two Rivers Ranch was a place where business could be conducted without fear of ambush or treachery. More trades followed, each one building trust incrementally. Apache families traded horses, beautifully crafted baskets, and tanned hides for tools, cloth, and other goods they could not produce themselves. Settlers gained access to Apache horses, which were renowned for their toughness and sure-footedness in rough country. Jake took no profit from these transactions beyond what was necessary to maintain the ranch. His goal was not wealth, but peace. There were tense moments and near disasters. One settler tried to cheat an Apache family on a horse trade, and only Jake's quick intervention and insistence on fair dealing prevented violence. An Apache warrior whose family had been killed by settlers came to the ranch intending to kill Jake as a representative of the people who had destroyed his life. Chief Nahilzai himself came and convinced the young man that killing Jake would dishonor the very family he sought to avenge. Through it all, Jake never forgot the moment in the canyon when he had chosen compassion over self-preservation. That choice had saved not just Ayana's life, but his own in ways that went far beyond physical survival. It had given him purpose again, a reason to get up each morning, a way to honor the values Mary and Emma had embodied years past. And Two Rivers Ranch became an established institution, a place marked on maps and known throughout the territory. Ayana married a warrior from another band and had children of her own, but she remained close to Jake. Visiting regularly and helping to maintain the bridge of understanding he had built, she became a storyteller, traveling between Apache bands and sharing the tale of the cowboy who gave away his only horse. Chief Nahilzai lived to see his grandchildren grow up in a world that, while still difficult and often unjust, had small pockets of peace and cooperation where once there had been only violence. On his deathbed, he called Jake to his side and spoke his final words to his adopted son. "You showed my people that change is possible, that old enemies can become family. This is your legacy. Cherish it." Jake Morrison, known to the Apache as Shiloh Nantan, lived into his 70s, never remarrying but never truly alone, surrounded always by friends from both cultures. When he died peacefully in his sleep, both Apache and settler communities mourned his passing. He was buried on a hill overlooking Two Rivers Ranch, and on his headstone were carved words in both English and Apache. He gave everything to save a stranger, and in doing so saved himself. The story of Jake and Ayana was passed down through generations, told around campfires and dinner tables in Apache oral tradition and in settler folklore. It became a legend, embellished and altered with each retelling, but always carrying the same essential truth, that a single act of compassion, performed without expectation of reward, can ripple outward in ways impossible to predict, changing not just individual lives but the course of history itself. Two Rivers Ranch continued operating long after Jake's death, maintained by families from both communities who understood its importance as a symbol of what humanity could achieve when it chose understanding over hatred. The land itself seemed to remember the covenant made there, remaining a place of peace even during periods of intense conflict elsewhere. And somewhere in the Arizona desert, in a canyon where a dying man once made an impossible choice, the wind still whispers through the rocks, carrying the memory of the day when compassion triumphed over survival, when love proved stronger than fear, And when one man's sacrifice created a bridge between two worlds that had seemed forever divided,